Welcome to Antara's AS CCR. As can be seen from the page, the is at the top, which is conventional for magazines. The cover splash is linked to the cover image by it being placed right under the image, which takes up the whole page. As is convention for independent film magazines, there isn't a banner splash, a strapline, or a puff to keep the page as empty as possible. There is a price line with a barcode on it to make it seem more like a magazine. There is a splash or cover line here with the plugs and a date line which has been obscured onto the page by placing it inside the serif of the masthead. There are no secondary images on the page either, again, to emphasize focus on the cover image. Also, there is no website or social networking information on the page or any publisher information on the page either. I established one image as dominant over the others by placing it in two vertical thirds, whereas the secondary images were smaller and were placed in only one column of text. I used the same text formatting as Sight and Sound did to make it seem more conventional, and used the same grammatical rules as were used in Sight and Sound. I did use the rule of thirds, but avoided using hard lines to make the page seem cleaner. I also increased the gutter and margin settings because they didn't look very aesthetically pleasing when I tried them out for the first time. I did have a date line embedded into the title to avoid you having an orphan there. Didn't have an ident or any website information, but did have some publisher and editorial information on the page. As is convention, the title, lead paragraph, and dominant image all take up the first page of the article. There is a secondary image in the article as well, but it doesn't take up the whole page, rather is embedded into the text on the second page of the spread. Neither of the images actually have captions, which I used as a means of subverting convention, just because I didn't have space on the page. Next, text formatting is conventional as well, as I use small unbold text and use bold and different colors to highlight important parts. There are no block quotes or color blocks to keep the page as empty as possible. I have used the rule of thirds and conventional settings for gutters and margins to establish this double page spread as conventional. As mentioned briefly in my blog, I wanted my product to tackle the issue of representation. Over the past 3 years, since I first started studying media at school, I have noticed the difference in the world I see around me and the world I see on my screens. This has made me recognize how many communities are underrepresented in the mass media, even though they may not actually be minorities. At a time when the Western film industry is becoming a melting pot of backgrounds, why is it that there are still certain groups that dominate others? Perhaps it is because we have become so accustomed to the faces that we see that we cannot imagine normal as being anything that differs from it. To highlight that normalcy can be maintained even if we represent people, cultures, or outlooks which are typically considered alien by the mass media, I decided to follow all the conventions of magazine layout and change only who I was representing through those conventions. Via my product, I am positively representing female directors, cinematographers, and editors. I am bringing forth a story of homosexual soldiers. I'm addressing the hiring bias in the industry in the context of feminism and stereotypes by talking about, for example, male makeup artists. And I'm pointing the lens towards people of color and interracial people in the industry. I'm simply defying the implicit and hushed conventions of mainstream media through representation. And having completed my product, I see that the media could be much more vibrant if only we would embrace color more openly. By targeting a more educated and aware audience, I am hoping that readers will either agree with my portrayals of ethnicities in the film industry or at least respond to it internally by processing it. However, if there are people who wholeheartedly believe that diverse representation is preposterous, then maybe gaining such an attitude from a hypothetically respected publication might sway them. To first establish my target audience, I had to research the readership of independent film magazines, and here is what I found from a 2013 BFI survey. This research helped me shape my primary demographic. I decided that it would be a mostly male audience who are over the age of 35 and work in a creative or academic industry in the context of media. Once I knew what work they might do, I was able to segment them into the AB socioeconomic group. Then, when dividing my audience in terms of psychographics, I thought of what values one would need to have to be able to accept diverse representation, and I concluded that my audience would consist mainly of reformers and explorers. So, after having a good idea of who my product might be aimed towards, I made a list of what all features my product would need to have or cover for it to appeal to this market, and I included them. I said that I would need to have a refined and stylish layout and color scheme, which I ensured by using a classic gold and maroon combination, along with a minimalistic design sense. I also made sure to use a sufficiently complex vocabulary to please a more academic audience. Finally, I gave the hypothetical films in the contents page titles that traditionally an independent film would have, so because these might be films that my target audience would be more likely to watch. To better fit into a largely digital world, I decided that a reel would have to be distributed online. I also wanted to go paperless because of sustainability issues that the earth is currently facing. However, as I am also looking to cater to an audience that is older and might be less tech savvy, and to a more academic audience, I would have to choose my platforms carefully. Each issue would only be available to those who have paid a monthly subscription fee. I thought that it might be beneficial for the institution and for the audience if school and university online libraries or anyone with a valid school or university email address would get subsidized rates of subscription. This would appeal to the academic part of my demographic. Also, to advertise my product to them, I thought it might be a good idea to release one regular as a free article to school or university websites every month. This might get people talking and create a buzz so that more people would be likely to subscribe to the magazine. Now, for the part of my demographic that is active in a media or creative industry, I thought that they would most likely be active on some social media site. So I looked at demographics of social media users for Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Since 84% of people between 30 and 49, 72% of people between 50 and 64, and 62% of people above the age of 65 use Facebook in the USA, a statistic far higher than that of the other two sites, I thought this would be the optimum platform to advertise Reel on. My production skills developed significantly throughout the making of these products. Firstly, Photoshop. When I first found out about the task, I knew that I would have to use Photoshop, and having not used it since doing my Media GCSE coursework, I was a bit apprehensive, and so I decided to start making practice images in my spare time. I did illustrations, I edited images that I'd already taken before at events, and I saw that I was already getting more confident with it. And by the time it came to actually making my pieces, I had a much better grasp of Photoshop than I did before. I now knew which tools would be appropriate to do what I wanted them to do. For example, I was having a lot of trouble with image editing because I was using the magic wand tool instead of the quick selection tool. And once and after experimenting with Photoshop for a while, I realized that my life would be much more convenient if I switched. There are more examples of this, and the more I used Photoshop, the better I got with it. As I had already used Photoshop before, I wasn't very nervous with it, but I was nervous when it came to using InDesign because I'd never ever seen it before. So, to help myself before production, I watched some videos on how to make the columns, the margins, how to input text boxes, how to embed images, and then during production, whatever else I needed to do on InDesign, I used the Adobe support website for that. Also, during production, what happened was that I kept developing ideas of what I wanted to do, and therefore that led me to exploring new tools that I hadn't actually watched on any of the videos. And this let me get a little bit creative, and this showed me things that I wouldn't necessarily find using a Google search. So my production skills were developing even further. In a more practical sense, my photography skills developed immensely. I was now learning how to use the studio efficiently and position the lights correctly, adjust their brightness and their hue so that I had a better and more well lit image. I was also learning how to adjust the settings on a camera because I was taking an online course on aperture, depth of field, ISO, and exposure, and I was now more confident when it came to using a DSLR. Finally, just through practice and through multiple photo shoots, I learned more about composition and color, and I was glad that I did it in a practical setting rather than sitting on my laptop watching videos about it. Although this was a product that I made mainly on my laptop, there were a lot of pieces of hardware that also went into creating these pieces. The most important aspect that I could not have done without hardware would be the pictures. For all of the images, I used a Canon EOS 70D DSLR camera and switched between an 18 to 35mm lens and a 75 to 300mm EF lens. When in the studio, I used the studio lighting and imported the images onto my computer using an SD card. After taking the images, I edited them on Photoshop to modify their brightness, contrast, vibrance, hue, darkness, shadows, highlights, and levels of exposure. I also used Photoshop to make the front cover of my magazine. However, I created my contents page and double page spread on InDesign CC. So, after I was finished editing the images that I needed on Photoshop, I exported them as JPEG images and embedded them into InDesign. Now, for my blog, I used an online website creation software called Weebly, and for my CCR, I used iMovie, which was an offline video editing software. Thanks for watching.